Hi. Thanks for joining us at LudoNarraCon to talk about the 90s, whether you experienced this decade or not. We're very excited to be here. We are Mighty Yell, everyone who you see around my camera right now. And we're making an adventure game called The Big Con. So this has kept us really, really busy studying many interesting things about the 90s, 90s games, 90s movies, 90s culture, just a lot of things about how we perceive the decade now. So let's start by introducing ourselves. I am talking first, so I'll go first. My name's Karina. I do the community management and the marketing management at Mighty Yell. Dave?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Dave Proctor. I am the director at Mighty Yell. Saffron?
Hi, the one with the totally real blue hair. I'm Saffron. I'm the art director and certified 90s baby.
90s baby.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Yash. I'm the producer, and I am also a 90s baby.
And I guess for the sake of today's conversation, we can say that 90s babies are like literal people who were baby in the 90s. And then some older people who are also here.
But we're not going to get too heavy into the like, age shaming of it all. I think the difference in our ages made the game pretty good. So
yeah, this is made for some very interesting conversations, and hopefully we can go over some of that today, just in terms of how the 90s are remembered and are kind of emulated or sort of, I guess, crystallized today. So along with a few other great people who are not here today, we are working together in Canada, and we're making a game that is sort of turned into a love letter to the 90s. It's called The Big Con. We'll give you a little bit more information about how to check it out later. But the aesthetic and the feel, and I think a lot of the work that went into the actual story and narrative is designed to try to convey as much of the 90s as possible. So why? I mean, besides the fact that some of us were obviously, sort of coming of age in the 90s, they left an impression. A lot of what we chose to talk about today has to do with the idea of the 30-year cycle. So for those who may not be familiar, back in around 2017, a fellow named Patrick Metzger wrote about something called the Nostalgia Pendulum. And it just sort of looks at how things tend to go in cycles when it comes to pop culture, how things that are old become new again. And essentially that through some research, he discovered it's sort of on a 30-year cycle. So I'm going to read you a little quote from him. So according to Metzger, it takes around 30 years for a critical mass of people who were consumers of culture when they were young to become creators of culture in their adulthood. And again, without pinpointing anyone's age, we're all definitely creators, and we're starting to have, I guess, more say in what we get to make and do when it comes to pop culture. So that's where, for some of us, it's sort of time to relive the late 80s and 90s. So we'll get a few other people on this panel's opinion, but you can definitely see how some things have resurfaced lately. I think Stranger Things, which is very 80s, definitely hit me hard and a lot of other people hard in terms of the nostalgia factor. But there have been other remakes lately, like Saved by the Bell and Full House, The Craft, which I heard is not a great remake. I guess Saffron's wearing a Wayne's World hat. You may have seen them in the Super Bowl recently.
For commercial.
So, for commercial value, no one paid us to do that, by the way. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely see how these things sort of come around again. And I guess I'm curious to know whether anyone else on the panel either agrees with this loop or disagrees or sort of sees it applied in a different way. I guess, Dave, I'll let you weigh in first since you're older like me.
age before beauty. Yeah, no, I like I think it's really hard to disagree with. It's something that I remember watching. If we look at like even in the 90s itself, right? The 90s like grunge movement was really based off of old, garage rock at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, and like the whole thing goes back really, really far. Movies in the 70s got excited about the late 40s and 50s, and
that's right.
Like it's there, and we get to be a part of it. I think, like you said, Stranger Things was like the nail in the coffin for the 80s. in like in a loving way. But like that's it's not gonna. There's gonna be more. There's gonna be more. More weird '90s stuff coming forward.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Saf, what do you think?
I agree. I think nostalgia is a powerful thing, and it is also a expensive thing or money-making thing. It's you grow up and you become an age where now you have money, and you're like, wow, I would love to relive these very specific emotions and feelings. I have the money now to pay for that and recreate
Seriously.
that. Not to spin like a
What?
consumerist spin on it, but yeah, and also, yeah, it's like wine, I guess. You bottle it up and you wait for it to become better, just like yourself. You get your skills and you draw for years until you can make a game about the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Yash?
Just like yourself, you bottle it up and wait till it becomes better.
Yeah, I think when that degree of time passes, you tend to think of the good things more than the bad things, and you wanna relive them. You wanna just go back into those memories, so you kind of create new ones that remind you of them.
That sounds like such
really well
a
put.
concept, that would come from a younger person, because I have mixed feelings about the 90s, I'll be honest. I was a teenager, so. But I think, Saf and Yash can vouch for sure. Even if you didn't experience them, they sort of had this cool resonance. And I mean, pop culture has been so inundated with the 90s, whether it's like retro stuff coming back or even just new takes that sort of feel like the 90s, but maybe aren't actually. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yash, I think you're kind of the most interesting perspective here, maybe because you were so young, very young in the 90s, but also not in North America, which is, a whole other discussion that we could have today. I think we're very much rooting this in like Western North American pop culture. But then you also, despite anything in terms of your geographical location, you also knew about the Backstreet Boys, and you mentioned a movie called Baby's Day Out all the time, which I hadn't even heard of until you.
I mean, Baby's Day Out was made by the same folks as the folks who made Home Alone, but it completely tanked in North America. But in India and China, it ran in the theaters for a year. And
wow.
It's a huge part of my childhood, that movie. And
I love it.
About the music, we had a channel where you would dial up and then select what song you wanted by pressing a button on your phone, and that's how we would play all kinds of music. In Backstreet Boys especially, I had a friend circle who would just dial in and pick that song to play on the TV.
Oh my gosh, cool. It's like early Spotify. That's so cool. I guess one of the other kind of interesting things about our team is that we have an art director, Saffron, as you may have already guessed from her comments, who also was sort of like baby in the 90s. But, our game, Dave, I don't know if you agree, but it really looks and feels like the 90s to me. I guess I'm curious how did you pick Saffron? Like, was that a tough choice to find someone who knew the 90s even though they weren't in it?
I don't know that was the decision. I don't know. I just wanted to work with Saffron.
Very true.
I thought she could do, we were doing like a sort of rescoping of how our visuals looked, and we wanted to think about things in terms of 90s comics and cartoons, looking at like Ghost World and Doug was where I was just like, I was like, here, this, like, what do you think of this stuff? And she did, exactly what I thought she would do, which was do a ton of cool research and come up with a pretty awesome aesthetic. And like, it didn't matter that, she didn't live through it. She's just good at her job.
I mean, Saffron, do you just have a really close relationship with cool 90s stuff? Did it come naturally?
I mean, it was definitely like something that is easier to research versus like if this was, I don't know, a game about Victorian times, it'd probably be actually, that's a bad example because there's so much media about it. But yeah, like stuff that already exists in my house or stuff that I do remember. Like, for example, I love this movie Recess growing up. I have all these VHSs, but this, like, I watched it in the 2000s, but it, like, this started in the 90s. So it's easy. Yeah, it is much easier when you have that a little bit of connection. But again, the popularity of it, the way that it's sort of been, brought back, and there's a lot to pull from.
Actually, you kind of bring up an interesting point about how things bleed over, because actually you use this word often, but the zeitgeist of the 90s wasn't necessarily created exclusively in the 90s. Sometimes it's people who are taking 90s content and seeing them in the context of the 2000s and maybe using it to feel good or to, harken back to their younger years. But I guess the broad stroke here is that we have people on this panel who both lived it and did not live it. And yet we've all kind of come to have this, I think, very intimate and common language and view of the 90s, this perception of what the 90s was. And that's kind of what we're here to talk about it. So, sometimes nostalgia serves us better. And my memory, as I said, of the 90s might not be totally positive, but sometimes I feel like I'm remembering it properly. And then I see what, Yash or Saffron have kind of created that is designed to emulate the 90s. And I'm like, no, that's better. Maybe sometimes it's more friendly, or they've just picked the good parts. So I think in general, we all kind of know the 90s are cool. So I think really what we're here to talk about today at LudoNarraCon is some of the weird challenges and opportunities that come when you're exploring stories that are set in the 90s, because we've had to make a lot of narrative choices. And I think the team has faced some difficult decisions, or at the very least decisions with, some pretty big repercussions for the narrative that we were trying to create. So first, let's just talk some basics about narrative. Obviously setting and some of the themes, making a 90s game. So, when we think about the 90s, it's a decade that has a lot of change. We've identified that there's some stuff that kind of rose to the top, but ultimately, if you think about 1990 and 1999, it's such a different time. Technology is kind of the easiest marker there, but there's all kinds of like cultural and political and social change that happened. That's kind of hard to put a pin in, but I think my feeling of the 90s overall is sort of, I guess, a decade of acceleration or a lot of progress. And I was a nerd, so computers were a big part of my 90s. That might be why. But I am kind of curious, like, Yash, how did the 90s feel for you? Like, what's your sense of the decade?
I feel very positively about that time. Like, I guess because I was really young, I was sheltered from a lot of weird stuff going on in the world. If it was, I don't think it happened. I feel like everything was fine in the 90s. I remember in late 90s, the first mall in India opened, and to go in, you had to show a credit card because not everybody had a credit card, and there was everybody just trying to go in and see what the hell a mall is.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So I remember those times fondly.
What about you, Dave?
What was the question again? I was just really fascinated by the first mall in India.
I know, right? That's like an interesting concept. I mean, I don't know if because we're older, we're sort of doomed to have a more negative perception of the 90s, but I'm wondering kind of like how they felt for you as a decade overall.
It's interesting because like I had to do a little bit of research before this panel to think about, what this meant from like a cultural kind of zeitgeist moment. Like how do people feel in the 90s apart from the sort of like, the narrative repercussions that we put into the game, which we'll talk about. I was growing up, right? Like I was coming into puberty and stuff. So I don't know that I'm paying attention to anything in the world. I think in that moment you're just focusing on yourself only, just growing and hating it. Like that was the vibe. But I definitely also feel that like bleeding edge acceleration vibe. I had a buddy whose dad worked for IBM, and that buddy now works for Google. So it's dynasty. But he used to show me all this cool stuff about computers, and like I learned like how to program websites. In the middle of the 90s, I was one of the first people I knew with an email address. But even like all of this stuff is kind of past what we're doing in the game, which is the pre-internet 90s. There's sort of like this split in the middle of the decade where the internet came around and people were talking about the internet, and you know, the aesthetic of weird, sleek, rounded Winamp skins is all that's popping into my mind. But like that very kind of shiny, glossy 90s is like the later half. And then there's the kind of grungy, you know, more colorful thing that I associate with the top half. And I remember feeling that shift, you know? I remember like sweatpants to silvery shiny pants. Raver pants.
Because the future
Randy
was
River
coming.
pants for my fellow Canadians.
Yes, that's true. Or mod robes.
Mod robes also for our fellow Canadians.
Also mod robes. I mean, I think that shift is something that was, I don't know if difficult's the right word. Everyone obviously like had to struggle with a lot of newness, but for people who were trying to like hold on to the early 90s, it also felt like things were changing very, very rapidly. And I remember when people started talking about, you know, the year 2000, Y2K, I felt like I was already losing part of my childhood, or that precious, as you say, moment that actually we chose to look at in the game, which is pre-internet, pre-cell phone, like very like local feel. That's interesting. Saffron, what do you think of when it comes to the 90s?
I growing up, you know, very young in it, I was very like, I was a kid, so my focus was usually on things like toys and shows and TV shows and stuff. So
Such a good time for toys.
Collectibles was like a big thing. I brought my old Tamagotchi, which I don't think I ever played with. It's one of those things I just find in my
Mine's
house,
dead.
and I've just always had it, and it just exists as a relic. But yeah, because my grandparents would take me to McDonald's, and I'd always be like, "What is it this time?" You know, like the Beanie Babies, the Furbies, the Hercules toys, it's all connected to like Disney and animation, and it's all connected. And yeah, it really was like a lot of like pop culture and stuff, I think, for me.
That's
It's
such
a really
a
bright
fun
spot for like
yeah.
for like pop and consumerist culture, which, you know, has its ups and downs, obviously. But like, especially if you grew up in that time, if you can think about toys, you can think about McDonald's toys, you can think about those. I remember like learning about the Disney release cycle, you know, like a movie will come out in the summer and then we'll get it on video in February. You know what I mean? Like that
Yes,
kind of
and
like,
you can reserve it
I
at
was like,
Christmas.
you can set your watch to that. Yeah, it was
No,
it
that's
was
very
really
true.
it was built for kids.
I feel like those early years also definitely formed what my ideal like boy was, because it like the 90s animated boy with like the kind of the middle part, and I was like, that's the boy.
I was
Like the
I was
Jonathan
gonna
Taylor
middle part my
Thomas.
hair. I was gonna middle part my hair for this panel, and I was like, no, absolutely not.
Might not have made such a big impression. Did you have any like of these classic 90s toys where you were a Yash when you were growing up? I'm curious, like did any of that come available in the market in India, or was it more when you obviously came to North America that you got first exposed to that?
Hot Wheels were really popular, and like we were all collecting them, and a bunch of my friends were collecting Pokemon cards, which were really rare to come by.
That's interesting.
I had
which are hot
like,
again.
I had like 10 Batman figurines with a whole bunch of different colors and costumes and gear that they came with.
The 90s was a big decade for Batman, actually, and movies. Like I know Keaton, I think, wasn't quite 90s, but it was a different Batman. Let's put it that way. It was
just top of the 90s, 89, 91.
Just very top. Very cool. I had like a 6-foot-tall Michael Keaton Batman poster in my bedroom at one point that I got from Shoppers Drug Mart, which is like a local pharmacy. Very strange. So I think it's funny when we're talking about
on the subject of the pendulum, Michael Keaton is going to play Batman in the Flash movie now. So, you know, this stuff is all happening constantly. Just to tie that off.
Flat disk. Further evidence. So I mean, ultimately, when it comes to putting things into a setting that is supposed to emulate the 90s, you can see that there's a broad diversity of elements here and decisions. And saying that you're putting something into the 90s doesn't really say enough. I think part of what we found during the making of our game, during our research, is that we had to basically make a lot of decisions about technology and advancement and even attitude, because there's a real like sarcasm element that we've woven into our game that it's very innocent, but I think it's also very 90s. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I think the places that we explored, and we talked a little bit about, for example, the mall, the places that emulate the 90s are also very different than, I think, contemporary adventure narratives where you kind of can travel a lot and go really far. And I guess it's definitely more globalized thanks to the internet. I guess I'd like to touch a little bit on how we tried to put the locations that we chose for our narrative firmly in the 90s versus another time. So Dave, I don't know if you want to talk about things like the mall or even like the bus stop, things like that.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, that's great. Like from the very get-go, you know, we wanted to, like, I wanted to tell a road trip story. I want to tell something that involves like, you know, traveling across the country, and like probably inspired very heavily by the movie The Wizard. If I'm being perfectly honest, like that's probably where this comes from. And like, if you think about a young kid traveling across the country to save something for their family, that's just The Wizard. So whoops. I don't think I've ever admitted that out loud.
It's tribute.
But
it's fine.
but there's the, you know, Wizard, he's like, he needs to go to California. He keeps talking about California. So, you know, like I always think about there's like this urban legend about what do you call it? Bioshock. Not an urban legend, but like it's a story about how, you know, the dev team for Bioshock wanted to create a game where the physical limitations of like the game space were represented in the world. Like the reason that you can't go outside is because it's water. You know what I mean? Like the reason that you can't, like, instead of invisible walls or whatever. And I think about our sort of 90s constraints in the same way, right? So like we needed a place where you couldn't, like, if you're going to con people, you need to not have a cell phone, and they need to not have the internet to learn about all these scams, right? And then from there, the opportunities of a road trip story are like, well, okay, for me, when I leave my small town, you know, growing up, it was like you either stayed in your neighborhood, which is our kind of main local town vibe, Lisbon County, and or you would go to the mall. So like the logical progression of like small town.
And that's it.
And that's it. That's the whole, that's your whole world when you like, before I could drive, before I flew places, before I moved away from Markham, it was like town, mall, and then to get out of that, you know, I think we go to a train because it feels a little bit more, like flights were still not the cheapest thing in the world. It was like, it wasn't like, you know, flying with the Wright brothers or anything like that. Like people were flying constantly, but that there's this vibe of the train, this kind of rundown transportation method, that I, you know, that always felt very 90s to me. I always saw like ads for trains growing up.
Well, and for a kid, I think for a teenager too, it's like, if you're going to be able to go anywhere and sneak around by yourself, a train is much more likely than an airport, even though I think you could still go to the airport without a passport at that time. But train is better.
You probably could.
Yeah,
you probably
it was a
could.
different time.
Yeah, there's less security about it, right? It has this sort of, and like I think trains always have this like nostalgic frontier brain to them.
Adventure.
You know, they're all yeah. There's this vibe of adventure that's not as fun on a plane, and like you can't get up and walk around and talk to people and steal their wallets on a plane, you know. So
good point.
and then moving to like, you know, our version of Vegas, of Las Venganza, like that to me seems like that was the pinnacle of 90s excess. Like that's the in a decade that is so kind of, oh yeah, there you go, in a decade that's so kind of typified by growth and like people going into debt, you know, riding off the high economy of the 80s and spending money. Like Vegas, yeah, that's where you go. That's where that's where things happen. Yeah, I don't know. It just, I don't want to say that it just poured out of us. Like, you know, when Jill Murray came up with the characters and the story, and she did some really great research and putting stuff together that felt like the right kind of road trip.
Yeah, I think what we ended up with is something that feels like it has a very 90s foundation without being like purposefully limited. The game still feels like you're on this rambling adventure where you can go anywhere within the means of your transportation. But yeah, like we did actually like make some choices to, I don't want to say cut things out, that sounds so negative, but we just knew there were places we couldn't go, or it would ruin that very 90s local, also young person feel of getting out in the world and you know, kind of discovering things.
Well put.
Yeah, and you know, all of this has to like be communicated through this weird aesthetic as well that really firmly places you in that decade. Las Venganza, I'm a big Las Vegas fan, and I've seen it change so dramatically. I mean, the 90s Vegas is nothing like it is today. Even Vegas 10, 15 years ago is nothing like it is today. So our aesthetic, I think, had to be applied in a way, not only, you know, to make sure that it looked cool and vibrant, but also to put some of those locations firmly into that 90s narrative feel. And again, to make it feel like we weren't making choices that limited maybe the player or the story, but actually made it feel more authentic and like there was more 90s to explore. I mean, Saf, I guess I'll leave it to you because you're the expert, but I'd love to know a little bit about about how you developed, I don't know, just like such a 90s vibe. It just screams the 90s. And we hear this from people who look at it all the time. So how did you kind of develop that aesthetic? Where did that come from?
So it's funny that you say scream the 90s, because I feel like a big part of art direction is basically the creative director is like, all right, I want you to give me this feeling. And then I have to go and do a bunch of mood boarding, basically with all my Pinterest, stick it in like a distiller, run it through a bunch of times so that I can get like the essential oil of the 90s.
90s
Gross.
essence.
Yeah.
We should bottle it.
90s essence.
The grease.
Ode to 90s. Yes, exactly.
The
And a
burger
lot of
grease on the styrofoam container of the
Oh my
decade.
gosh.
and that is basically like it. So I was looking at things that were popular and sort of the loudest things that were visual. I looked at a lot of cartoons and a lot of like movies, like a lot of animation stuff because that's brighter. I looked at a lot of patterns and stuff. Like a lot of people say our game reminds them of Doug, and we looked at Doug and Rocco's Modern Life, and I think like
Yay.
looking at like the common thread with a lot of the cartoons and like the style in the 90s, like why they were, and a lot of it was color, and I think that was sort of what we built a lot of our game around, was finding that key color palette, you know, that the bright primary and neon colors, like the bright pink, blue, green, and yellow is sort of like this palette we worked with. Like my hair, the bright colors. Like it's a lot more fun.
Oh, Yasha's shirt.
Yeah. And kind of clashy, but not clashy. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to offend you by saying that, but yeah, like that
No,
sort of
no.
like shocking combo, but also works.
Yeah, we tried to play a lot with like patterns and stuff as well, and like I have a comic book like background as well, so we leaned into bright bold colors and like bright lines to sort of come up with, you know, the aesthetic, the 90s distilled aesthetic that we have for the big con.
I mean, it's definitely it's definitely something that packs a punch. Like it's a hard aesthetic to miss in terms of its brightness, but I think a lot of that has to do with the attitude that we're trying to convey in the game as well. Not just because we made a game about like low-key con artistry, but also because it's like a teenager and they're sort of like going on a scrappy adventure, as Dave explained. I mean, Dave, I don't know if you want to touch on some of the actual video game aesthetics that maybe inspired us to go in that direction, because I know we've had some conversations about the punchiness of 90s video games specifically.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, I'm thinking about, you know, the way that everything got really gray and brown in the 2000s. You know, like there was a real shift away from color.
Like monochrome,
Yeah,
monotone.
like early Gears of War. You know what I mean? Like it's and that's not, there's nothing wrong with that. It was just like the style that everybody wanted right then. It led itself to a certain amount of seriousness, and it's like the difference between GTA 4 and GTA 5. Like they're very, from a color perspective, they're very different. But if you look at like, you know, Toe Jam and Earl, like in terms of brightness and visual aesthetic, I remember playing the what do you call it? The Simpsons game on SNES. I don't even remember what it was called. Oh my god, I
Like
love
Road
that.
Rage?
Where you would throw,
I like Hit and Run.
No, earlier,
Hit and Run.
There was like a licensed Simpsons game after the arcade beat 'em up, but before
Oh, okay.
the
I
Road
love
Rage,
that arcade.
where like there was a bunch of mini games, and one of them was like throwing tomatoes at Principal Skinner and stuff like that. But like the interstitial, the menus and stuff like that, just they bled. They were so bright. Yeah, I love that. I love that growing up. I think it's a very, I think that was like, you know, as acceleration and growth go, the power of those consoles was showing off color. So hey, look at how much color we can show off, right? Like
That's a great point.
That was the goal.
That's a great point. And again, like they were trying to hook kids who were of a certain age and interest level, and using that mechanism. I mean, we see that in advertising to kids nowadays as well, but it worked. We wanted the toys, we wanted the games, we wanted the T-shirts, we wanted to go buy the movie after, like everything, right?
Yeah.
And I will say, like, as much as we're talking about visuals and sort of these like aesthetic cues that we gave people, our choices around their art style, like I said, did kind of go deeper than just like making it look like the 90s. We sort of wanted to make the game, I don't want to say feel like a 90s game, because 90s games had, you know, narrative games in particular had sort of like specific elements. But we did look at the gameplay from those games as well, not just the look and feel of them when we were looking at themes. So, you know, we've talked a little about the idea that games for the 90s refuse to hold your hand. And I know that sort of played into how players were encouraged to explore things in the game that we made. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think Yash has played the game more than I have at this point.
That's true. I mean, yes. Does our game hold your hand? Is it as hard as some of the 90s adventure games that we might be thinking of?
It isn't as hard as those games, because those games had a video game logic which only worked and made sense in the world of the game. But our game just lets them free into a world where there's a million ways to get to your goal, and you can choose what you want to do instead of having a path handed to you, like a lot of new games do.
Yeah, we were talking about, I think it was Assassin's Creed recently, where there's basically just like points on a map that you're trying to get to, which again is not to criticize that kind of game, but there's a big difference between that and these like old 90s, especially PC games, where you kind of like had to feel your way around and figure it out. And certainly if you weren't the type to read the instruction manual, you're really on your own. And I think those games can be kind of hard in a good way too. Yeah.
Yeah, and like speaking of manuals, you know, like I'm a huge Monkey Island fan, and that has never gone away. When I played that in the LucasArts, like, you know, narrative adventure box that came with like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and The Dig and Zach McCracken and I think Day of the Tentacle, and it came with a manual, and like the manual had like a hint guide, but it was written in the like as a diary of Guybrush Threepwood, and it was like so very specifically cool. And I remember loving getting lost and being frustrated in the game, like not frustrated, but like I don't know what to do, and looking at the manual and having something to do. So I think that was like a lot of like what the, you know, the design philosophy was here, is like, you can go anywhere to do anything. You can maybe get stuck, but there are other things that you can do along the way, right? Like that's
a good way to put it.
90s plus.
So, I mean, that's and that goes again with both setting and theme. I think if we kind of move along into our plot, we made a lot of choices plot-wise about how to present a story and sink you into some of these game experiences. I do want to touch a little bit more on technology, because cell phones we decided to not have in our game. And I was reminded recently, with I think it was the 30-year anniversary of Home Alone, that if, Kevin and his family had just had cell phones, it would have ruined the whole movie. And there's a lot of 90s stories that are ruined by technology in that way. So narratively speaking, Dave, can you maybe touch a little bit on how we handled communication in the game and like basically the absence of internet and cell phones?
Yeah, I mean, and like, we talked about this a little bit a while ago. I think like, so you can, you talk to people. It's a game about talking to people. It's not a game about calling someone on a cell phone because you need to speak to them immediately to solve a problem. It's about like, without that tool, without this thing, how do I function, right? You have to talk to people. It just makes sense, like that mechanically.
Old school.
And then you can use a payphone to call your mom while you're on the road, or a friend from high school, but you get
Also
her
old school.
voicemail. Yeah, you get her voicemail and you have to leave her messages because like you didn't have that immediate connection. And I think, we talked about this the other day, like if you don't have a cell phone, if you don't have the ability to like, my cell phone is a curated collection of things that make me feel comfortable, right? Like that's what that is. And if I don't have that, then I have to, there is a sense of discomfort. And like as Allie goes on without her safety net, without her people, and she travels throughout the world, it starts to like hit her. Like without a cell phone, I think you have a bit more progression and change. I think cell phones enable us to stay connected, but also like to stay kind of the same in a way, like comfortable. And
That's a
without
good
that
point.
yeah, without that, you have to kind of react to the world around you a little bit more.
Which is kind of what Allie's doing throughout the entire game. I mean, you talk about what happens when you don't have a cell phone, and I think a large part of what we've written in, and it does harken back to 90s games, is the notion of interactables. And to progress the narrative, whether it's the direct narrative plot that we're trying to advance or just to develop the characters themselves, we've created a world where you have to interact constantly, and that's your main mechanism for gathering information. Saf, I'd love if you want to touch on some of the more fun interactables that we have in the game. Like, I know you mentioned, for example, the 90s was full of toys and memories of that stuff for you. How do we sort of weave some of that into the plot in terms of Allie's interactions?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, yes, the fun of interactables in like the actual 90s, but sort of bringing it back to the fun of like 90s games. It was always fun for me to play a game and like pressing A around and seeing what would react to me. So we have things like that, and where you can kick things, and Allie will comment on that. She can find different things and wear different things, and there are a lot of like fun collectibles and references. Like that's one of my favorite things as well. Like it's fun to create these things and that are funny and make sense in our world, but are also funny to the player because they recognize what the thing is. So yeah, it's fun exploring and discovering those things.
I like the idea of constantly being surprised too, but then sometimes you're surprised by something that you end up recognizing. So for example, like an old toy that might be from the 90s, you actually find it and you kind of remember it loosely, or other people have placed a lot of value on it, so you kind of recognize that it's a collectible, cool thing. Awesome. So we're fitting in a lot to this panel today, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to some of the cooler elements. I guess the last thing that I want to touch on is sort of the conflict that we built into our game. So, we've gone over settings and themes and sort of the plot and how that sort of shaped our character choices and decisions. But the main conflict in the game is actually someone saving a small business, which is, I think, still very important today, but definitely has sort of a 90s feel to it. I guess, Yash, I'm curious to know if you did this conflict sort of make sense to you, given that you weren't sort of in North America during the 90s, but I'm sure you've seen small business struggles and sort of that story come into play?
Yeah, I think because this story is it's a very personal story. It's a very personal story in a larger world, and 90s are happening while this story is happening. So in that sense, I have seen instances like this around me. Yes, of course. Businesses struggle all over the world, and especially 90s and the early 2000s were a time when a lot of multinational corporations were taking over, and a lot of small businesses were going out of business. So I have seen that firsthand.
Which is not to say that that's the only thing happening on our story, but it's definitely one of the primary sort of conflict drivers, right? Dave, I don't know if you want to touch on just the notion of debt and some of the decisions that are having to be made in the game. We only have a few minutes, but I feel like the 90s was a time when people were not super wealthy, even though they were spending the money, as you mentioned. What does a local business mean to the 90s for you? Especially a local video store.
Yeah, and so Allie's trying to save her family video store from turning into essentially a Blockbuster, a Videoville. But I think like the takeaway there, and the lesson to me is kind of the same, where as anything that you would want to hear right now, which is like, we need a little bit of strength to kind of fight against forces that are happening quickly around us, whether or not we want them to. People were racking up debt, and small video stores were going down, and that was part of the growth of the 90s. That was a huge thing, and like that's still happening. It's probably worse, but it's about the relationships that you form and the people that you protect and the things that are important to you in the face of all of that. Like, what if you don't save the video store? Like, what have you saved? And like that's not a negative thing. There's a positive answer there, I think.
And I think it sort of comes back to family and local, and the idea that although the world is very large, your world can be very small, and the things that matter to you can be very focused. So definitely we've built up a lot of conflict around putting some pressure on Allie to save her family video store, but also just the idea that the world is moving in on some of your perhaps most cherished items, and you are tasked with saving them. We don't have tons of time left, so I do want to be mindful of sort of the LudoNarraCon panels. We will be putting up some photos of all of us in the 90s on the @MightyL channels if you guys are interested to come and check it out. Obviously, The Big Con is a game that we would love for you to come and learn more about. thebigcongame.com is our website. You can see our trailer there. I think the final thing that I believe we have time for is to share some 90s slang. So I'd like to take turns, and I'd like to hear your number one piece of 90s slang, and I'd really love if you could say it in the most 90s way possible. Let's start with Yash, who I think will have the hardest time.
Okay. Well, the most iconic one for me was rad, which means cool to me.
Rad. That's cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Saffron?
So I feel like just because I'm wearing this hat, I have to be like, party on! Excellent!
Live up to the hat. That's cool. Exactly. Dave, how about you?
I'm gonna go with I think Yesh took mine. So I'm gonna say gnarly. That's where I'm gonna end on today.
Gnarly. Yeah, the Simpsons blanket doesn't show it, but Otto's one of my favorite characters. My favorite line, I think, comes from a movie, and I feel like I need to have like a pen or a cigarette in my mouth, which is also very 90s. Hold on to your butts from Jurassic Park, which is one of my favorite movies. So yeah, I think I want to thank everyone for joining us to talk about the 90s.
Thank you, LudoNarraCon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, LudoNarraCon.
Thank you.
We're fully immersed in this decade, but you don't have to have lived it to get it. And you definitely don't have to have lived it to enjoy stories that are set in the 90s like The Big Con. So
thanks, everybody.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.